In this session, we're going to look at what it means to have a mission. And it's a needed session because I think the words, the mission of the church, become something that we talk about and say all the time, so much so that we lose the actual meaning of those words. Before we do, I'll just very quickly bounce through the Hope Project, just to update you on where we're standing. The Hope Project this year, thank you to all who participated in any way. The TV ads were seen by somewhere under 2 million. Online, it was 511,000 people who engaged with online media around Easter this year. It's separate to websites. The booklets went immediately to 1.361 million homes. About 150,000 extra booklets went out, which different people utilised. And so that you're aware, all of the booklets we have had, I have deliberately pushed that we would print tens of thousands of spares because we managed to get a remarkable print price when you print about 1.6 million. So if you'd ever like copies, they are free and we will courier them to you for free. So they're, I think, an amazing resource. They carry aspects of our nation's bicultural and global history and heritage. They validate some important messages, and I would encourage you to utilise them. In terms of the branding, this is a PDF, just screenshot jumping on the screen here. But that's the concept behind the Hope Project at Easter. And it deliberately, in its branding, tries to connect into some key concepts and ideas. Amazing Grace is a well-known song. The cross comes in there, tears down it, throw in a concept of compassion. And attempting to get Hope Project Christmas happening, the branding concept that's sitting on our tables at the moment looks like this. And as Tony has said, the simple idea is that if we could get nativity scenes back into Christmas, the story bounces out of the nativity scene. And we know that the shepherds and the wise men wouldn't have all been there at the same time. It's just a piece of artwork. And if we could do this at the individual level with Christmas cards, like on the top left there, it can be done in shops on displays, it can be on business windows with Merry Christmas with Christ in capital letters as part of the branding. It could be on billboards like the demonstration there outside a cafe. We could do this on multiple fronts, and within 2, 3, 4 years, we could actually shift public opinion. And this is how change happens. Gordon has relayed to us how people with an intent to change the thinking of our nation undertook to do so and succeeded. And many of us have lived through amazing changes in the thinking of our nation. There is a public conversation that we need to engage, and that will be the topic of my closing address at the conference today. For this one here, I want us to step back a few steps and to look inside the church and to look at the way that we think, because the way that we behave is the product of how we think. If the church isn't effectually mobilised to its mission, the question has to be why. What is it in the way that we think or perceive things that is some way hindering us from being the fullness of all that we could potentially be? Whether we're talking about individual witness, local church, or the ministries that we see sitting around us in the auditorium today. As an illustration which I shared 2 years ago, if you imagine I have a big jar in front of me and it's been filled with rocks and sand of different sizes until it is full. And I empty it out, you've got to put the big ones in first. And so I find, here we go, the Sunday service, and I put a big rock into the jar. And then you're going to have your small groups. So here's some small groups, they're pebbles. And then there's a pink one for the women's ministry. There's a blue one for the men's ministry. There's a soccer ball looking one for the sports ministry. And then there's the sand, and that's the people. Then there's a jug of water, and that's the Holy Spirit and prayer. And I finish it, and there's a bit of space, and stink. Behind it, I've missed the biggest rock. It's the mission of the church. This is the problem with the Western church. This is the challenge. We've got a whole way of thinking about and doing church in which the mission of the church is not the integral core, centre and focus. If something is your mission, it means that absolutely everything is oriented around it. And this isn't the way that we are doing church. So what we do is we grab a hammer and a chisel and tap, tap, tap. We chop a corner off, and God bless them, it's alpha. And we grab alpha and we stuff it in. Now, there is nothing against Alpha. It's a fantastic program. And then we do the same. And thanks, Amy. Chip, chip, and Cap goes in. And chip, chip, chip. And we try to get the mission of the church back in. And all of these ministries are fantastic tools. The problem is we're still sick at our core. Because our core DNA is not evangelistic, is not genuinely and authentically outreaching. And I've seen it before with Alpha, which is a spectacular multi-pronged resource because you've got different types of courses they provide also. And you end up with a group in a corner lamenting how no one else cares about the lost and doesn't invite anyone, struggling to find people to invite. Because it's a program. You can't fix a paradigm problem with a program solution. You've got to come back and say, what's the problem with the paradigm? What is it in our thinking here that isn't quite right or aligned to the truth or to God's wills or ways? And we need to address that. And it's out of this reflection that the concept of the 4 pistons of outreach and mobilisation came. We need to mobilise the church as individuals, as small groups, as local congregations, and then on the combined piston. And the illustration is very simply that a 4-piston car isn't going to even move on 2 pistons. It might move unhealthily on 3, but really you need all 4 pistons running. However, most churches are functioning on only 1 or 2 of those pistons. And this is the reason why evangelism isn't energised. In terms of what the key thing they contribute might be and where the starting place is in these 4 pistons, I would suggest that the congregation is the starting place. It rises and falls on leadership. The key leaders in the church need to accept that it is their responsibility to ensure that their local church authentically follows its mission. They say it's the mission, it's got to be so measurably, observably, and in practice. They need to lead the way from the front, they need to cast the vision. However, if that's the starting place, I would suggest that the individual is the most important piston. And this is very simply because 100 mobilised members can achieve far more than a talented pastor. But if that's the most important, which is the home base? And I would suggest that the home base is actually the small group. And this is because if we're in a church and I'm your pastor, imagine, and I'm motivating you to go out there and to engage conversations and encourage faith, you can be thinking about something else. You're sitting there, you're nodding, you're smiling. I say a joke, you even laugh, and you're thinking about lunch, and you're thinking about your family and whatever else. We know how to fake it. I don't know if any of you are listening to me right now. I've preached plenty of times, you know. However, when you're in the small group, you can't hide. Because, what do you think, Robin? What do you think, Gordon? And so there's a... Thanks, bro. Yeah, that's right. I agree. And there's engagement, there's accountability. And so if a small group becomes focused on its mission, it can actually be an encouraging, mobilising power that is sustainable and can bring about results. Finally, the combined piston, I think the key thing it contributes is that it is the majority reach. And we will come back to this later. The majority reach piston, number 4, is a very weak piston in New Zealand. The second piston, the small group, is almost non-existent in the New Zealand church. I do think from a leadership perspective that you need to start with 3 and then focus on 1. Then as number 1 begins to take off, you will realise that all your upfront efforts are insufficient to mobilise your members sustainably. You see, you'll catch some keys of momentum and leadership and equipping and mobilising, and people will begin to move and you'll feel excited, and then 3 months later somehow you'll be back where you were. And you'll begin to think, what's the problem? And when you've battled with discouragement for about 2 or 3 years, you'll suddenly realise that, maybe there's a key thing sitting in the small groups that we haven't yet energised and channelled in the way that we could. So let's start going through these, and the way that change takes place, here's a simple analogy. Is that academics and thinkers conceptually come up with an idea where they think that maybe we're thinking wrong. Creatives then disseminate that to a wider group of people who disseminate it to an even wider group. And following a university study out of America I'll refer to later, you cross a certain threshold, a tipping point, typically about 10%, and the majority follow. Culture doesn't just change, culture is changed. And what this means is that if we're willing to engage with the logical things that sit in some pictures, we can change not only the thinking of the church nationally, we can potentially engage in the public conversation, which again is where I'll take us at the end of the day. Okay, the individual piston. Its strategic place, as I have said, is that it is the most important piston, because 100 mobilised members can achieve far more than a talented pastor. What is the key change in thinking that's needed to help members be mobilised? And my conclusion is that evangelism needs to be with a conversational approach as contrasted with a truth-based confrontational approach. And I think this epitomises the key change that we've observed over the last maybe 20, 40, 50 years. To give you a download on some of the thought processes that sit behind this, the key question for me is, how do you tell the truth to someone who doesn't believe religious truth even exists? The answer that we have to somehow get the revelation on, which a teenager can tell us quickly where an adult can't, is that you can't. You can't tell the truth to someone who doesn't believe truth exists. This is the challenge we have in a postmodern society in communicating the Christian message. It begs the question, what can we do? And the answer is you can talk with them about it. It's called conversation, and great conversations are never further away than some great questions. And it's biblical. Jesus' model, his example, if we look at the way he engaged with individuals, was that it was a conversational approach with an ear open to the Spirit. His approach to engage was to ask questions and then to listen to those gentle whispers. In terms of mobilising people, one of the key thoughts I think that catalyses movement where people have become immobilised through bad previous experiences is this controversial sounding suggestion. If you're immobilised in evangelism, here's your key: remove the agenda of sharing the gospel. For a while. Deliberate pause, even for quite a while. And the reason doesn't take much to work out. If you remove that agenda, what are you nervous about? You've got no agenda. In which case, if you're interested in rugby, ask about rugby. If you're interested in spiritual stuff, ask about spiritual stuff. See where it goes. Out of interest, are you a spiritual person? And you can ask that with authenticity, and people can tell you're not trying to sell something. Whereas when you're trying to sell something, you're nervous because you know you are, and you can't tell truth to someone who doesn't believe truth exists, and they can tell. We live in the most media-saturated, market-driven society in all of human history. You're then going to get in conversations, questions are going to open it up, and you're soon going to discover that you fundamentally disagree. So spiritual deception, here's the next key. You applaud what is good and ask questions about what you don't understand. You avoid disagreeing. When you do disagree, you simply say, hey man, I love the fact that you're spiritual. What do you think about this? Or where'd you get that idea from? Or have you ever considered this? I think the next direction that the conversational training in our nation needs to go to is how to deal with conversations within hostile environments. We've been in an environment that's been, sort of neutral up until the last decade or so. But we're going into an increasingly hostile environment toward the Christian worldview. And it just so happens that Jesus lived in such an environment. So we need to learn how to not give the quotable quote. We need to learn how to not answer the question. We need to learn how to tell stories that confuse people. And all of these things have Jesus as their originator. Tell me, Jesus, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah, the promised one, the Son of God? What are you hiding from, Jesus? Why won't you just answer a simple question? Come on, Jesus. This woman caught in adultery. We're supposed to stone her. The law says so, right? So tell us, teacher, what are we supposed to do? Jesus, what are you doing down there? Why won't you answer the question? You should, if you think it's the truth, just speak up, mate. You don't have to be scared. Just be authentic and be real, Jesus. Why don't you just tell us? It says they were pressing him for an answer. That would have been awkward. And then with wisdom from the Spirit, he stands and says, he who is without sin, cast the first stone. What were Jesus' parables? They weren't just mechanisms of communication to illustrate a point. They were mechanisms of confusion to conceal the truth. We've been telling people for years to be clear in their communication. Yeah, parables communicate, but also it's pretty clear that the disciples even thought Jesus was going mad at some points because nothing he said made sense because he talked in parables all the time. They were a mechanism of dividing the interested from the disinterested, and hopefully the interested would continue to seek, and revelation and understanding of the story would come. There are skills for communication for us to consider. So that's piston number one. And a strategic place and the key change in thinking. As altogether.co.nz, just to give some resources, If you hover over the resources, you can go down to equipping members, and there is a simple video series. I intend to add 10 more videos to this, God willing, in about 6 months' time, including how not to answer questions and how to answer questions with questions. Stu Miller has also produced a series there on how to reach people you don't know, a training series, short 5-minute videos. In addition, godtalk.nz, scroll down, and on the left there are equipping videos designed for young people, for their youth ministries. They have discussion guides under them. My first 2 books on evangelism, Because We Care and Elephant in the Room, both include this content. 3 other great books on the topic are God Space by Doug Pollock, Conversational Evangelism by Norman Geisler, and Tactics by Gregory Kukul. The middle book there by David and Norman Geisler, I actually summarised that book into a short 2 chapters of Because We Care with their permission. I was quite amazed, and so you've got a Reader's Digest version available there. Piston number 2. The small group, the key place it has strategically is the home base for evangelism. Again, because when you motivate at a congregational level, the members are faceless. In a small group, there is accountability. One of the ironies of this base is that if we want evangelism to be relational, if we mobilise through the small group, we never need to say be relational, nor do we ever need to teach it again. Because when you are mobilised from a relational small group, your outreach will naturally be relational. And in my own experience, this has been the most effective base. I have never seen people come to faith in Jesus equivalent to when I saw this particular base becoming effective. The key change in thinking that I think is needed here is that the church small group has a mission. It is the mission of the church. We have this misnomer that our church small groups are somehow protected little bubbles, and the church, that word somehow belongs to the gathering on Sunday morning. And so if we're meeting on Wednesday in a small group, somehow we're in a bubble and we're separate to that and we don't carry those responsibilities. That's simply not true. The early church was a small group based church. It was small groups and large groups, home to home and in synagogues. When persecution came, it was a small group church for a couple of 100 years exclusively. It was highly effective, as the cell church movement around the world also demonstrates. The philosophy of outreach through a small group is really pretty simple once we get the nuts and bolts of how it works. We list those we'd like to reach out to, we pray for them, we ask for wisdom. We discover that Gordon's friends like to go fishing, Robin has a boat, and I've got the gift of the gab. So we take me on his boat with his friends. It's really that simple. And so we find the interest points, we find the connection points, and then we set simple habits. The first week of every month, we're going to pray for the friends we listed at the start of the year that we'd like to encourage toward faith this year. It reminds. On the 3rd week of every month, we're going to ask the question near the start of our small group meeting, has anyone had a chance in the last 4 weeks to engage a non-church friend or family member in a spiritual conversation? We simply hear the story, we affirm the value, and we use it as a springboard for promoting or reminding the group of some things that we've been taught through our pulpits or through our small group studies on outreach. You begin to do those things as habits, stuff will begin to change. The third piston, resources at altogether.co.nz. We've been creating leadership resources for elders groups to look at this, to try to convince their thinking so that it can then go into the culture of the church. So AT Consulting is just Altogether Consulting, in other words, pastor stuff. And there are 4 videos down there. One is on small group. You could look at that. I've also got 2 chapters on small group outreach theory in both of those books, Elephant in the Room and Because We Care. And I think that the culture principles of organic outreach by Kevin Harney also are applicable here. I'll mention them more in a second. Now, piston 3 is the local congregation mobilising from the Sunday platform. I say this as the starting point, as mentioned earlier, because leaders have to lead. It's got to start from there. And a statement that I gave you a couple of years ago for amusement was that the main person through the main platform has to make the main thing within the main thing the main thing. That's really what I want you to get, and you got that? Awesome, we can move on. So, no, the main person is the pastor, through the main platform is the pulpit. What are we doing evangelism training and seminars for? That's dumb. How about we put evangelism in seminars and we'll put all teaching from the Word in seminars? Should we do that as well, eh? So teaching from the Bible, that can go in seminars. Let's keep the pulpit free for other things. That's clearly dumb. The pulpit's for the Word of God. The pulpit's for the mission of the church. It is a disrespect, it is a theological complete miscomprehension to put evangelism in a seminar. The key leaders of the church have to lead the church in its mission because the mission is the main thing. It's not the role of the evangelist to lead it in the mission. It's the role of any person in a leadership position because it's our mission. It's what we're here for. The main person, the pastor, through the main platform, which is the pulpit, has to make the main thing within the main thing the main thing. Now, the main thing is the mission of the church. The main thing within the main thing is piston number one. It's the mobilisation of the individual. Because the mistake that we're going to make at this level is to think that you guys are so useless, you never go out and encourage others to come to faith. As the pastor, I'm going to fix it, we'll run programs. And I suddenly become program dependent. I'm trying to fix a paradigm problem with a program solution. If we focus on equipping members to engage everyday spiritual conversations, what happens is that we are the ones pushing and making it happen for a year. And we're engaging with certain habits for a second year, and we're engaging for a third year, but they're beginning to get it. And when we come to engage for the fourth year, somebody's ahead of us. And someone over here has dared to think. They dared to think for themselves and came up with a new idea that I never even suggested. And someone over here suddenly starts doing something that I've never even thought of before. And suddenly the entire dynamic flips itself over. Because it takes time to build culture. But as the culture gets built, the initiative shifts from the person who's trying to build the culture into the members, and the initiative begins to spring up everywhere. That's when the sleeping giant of the church begins to actually arise and to achieve its mission at a different level. The main person, the pastor, through the pulpit, has to make the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry in outreach in their everyday lives the main thing within the church. And when we do that, we'll see a lot of things changing and turning around. The pizza illustration, which you will have heard before, is that the base of the pizza is the culture of the church. The programs are the toppings. We have different types of churches, we have different types of pizzas, but they all share a reasonably common base. Churches try to fix the problem with programs. You end up with a sloppy mess of stuff with nothing to hold it together. Work on the culture, then seek the Holy Spirit as to what programs you need to build the kind of pizza that God has intended you to be. To be able to move the members, it comes down to habits that we embrace. It's not a program thing. We need to, this is a diagram that Stu Miller uses in Australia. I use it here when I speak on this topic in New Zealand. It starts with the pulpit and is a simple model of the habits a pastor or key church leader could embrace. At the start of every school term, give a message to motivating members on what the mission of the church is. It's only 4 out of 52 weeks. You've got 48 left. And just focus on it. And this coming term, we're going to have this and this. And in community ministries, there's this. And in your small groups, consider this. And we look at the Word of God here and remind of some things. Once a year, the red 4 blocks in a row in February there, give a full month to equipping the saints for the work of outreach through the pulpit. Make it your topic. When I first did this, I was wondering why the dumb members weren't going out and evangelizing, but even worse, I started running evangelism seminars as a pastor, and after 2 years, I was frustrated. I'm thinking, don't they get it? Don't they understand that people without Christ are going to a lost eternity if our Christian belief is true? I can't understand why you guys won't turn up to this evangelism seminar I'm running. And as I lamented it, feeling sorry for myself, I looked in the mirror and thought, wait a minute, maybe they're not the problem, maybe I am. Why am I doing seminars? And so I took that content and put it in the pulpit for a first time and equipped 100% of the attending members. That was a big one. And then the next year, what was I going to preach? Because everything I did in the seminar was covered in 4 weeks with 4 intelligently matching small group studies. I suddenly needed to find new content. And do you know what? For the first time, I was able to begin to analyse the effectiveness of my equipping. Because did my equipping actually mobilise people sustainably? No, it didn't. It was actually deficient. And that led me to something that I now found funny, that people think evangelism training is about teaching people how to share the gospel. And I almost laugh at that. Of course it is. Of course the gospel's the main thing. But it takes 5 minutes to teach someone to share the gospel. It's going to take a long, long time to teach them the skills needed to engage in non-threatening two-way spiritual conversation with someone they fundamentally disagree with. The 90% majority or more of the training, in my view, is conversational skills and a whole stack of reiteration and encouragement and growth to develop that skill set to be able to engage. The small groups then all do studies as a habit in the church whenever I preach on the mission of the church. On the other weeks, you get to choose what you want to study in your small group. And then, on the first week of every month, we have a testimony from someone who's sought to engage a conversation with a non-church person. That models what this can look like in application. But for the pastor, it's intended as a springboard. Because I go, wow, Robin, what an amazing testimony. Did you notice how, in what he said, it started with a question, didn't it? He took a selfless interest in someone else and dared to ask some questions, and the Lord opened the opportunity. Remember, folks, great questions are the key to great conversations. And just to test your memories, we talked at the beginning of the year about three questions that could turn a conversation. Can anyone tell me what they are? That's right. What do you mean by that? Where'd you get that idea from? Have you considered? It's no further away than questions. I encourage you in the coming week. Who could you ask a question? And just like that, in 60 seconds, you've reaffirmed a value as a leader, and you've actually done a key educational thing. It's called repetition. Because repetition is the key to learning. Teaching something doesn't mean it's taught. Repeating something means it's taught. And that's something for us to comprehend in our churches. Finally, there's got to be gospel preaching. It's got to be modelled through the testimony of the pastor, through the testimony of members, but also in the pulpit. Those kind of practices will build culture. So my 2 books on evangelism are both written to communicate everything that's said so far. The pinky one is the resource one, which is long, and the green one seeks to summarise it, because the pastors who read the pinky one didn't change their thinking. And I realised that it was coached in too many words, so I simply tried to go for the principles without any extra in the green one. Organic Outreach by Kevin Harney is about it's a habit-based approach, the same as the stuff that I've produced. And he talks about the 1 degree rule and the 2 degree rule. And the 1 degree rule is simply that whenever you meet in any group at any level of church, be it the elders board or a small group, you ask a question every time you meet. How could I be that 1 degree more outreaching? What could I do to be that little bit more geared up to actually connect someone with Christ? And by asking that question again and again every time you meet, it develops an outreach consciousness within the church. And so it's the same kinds of leadership principles. Oh, by the way, Altogether Consulting, again, at the website, 4 videos, an introductory workshop for church leadership teams. The second one is the stuff I just shared with you, the small group one, and one on conversation as well. And also, if you scroll up, there is a sermon and outlines study thing, and you'll see these yellow folders on our desk out just outside the doors. We've currently produced 6 sermon series that pastors can simply pick up, and there's your evangelism training. 4 sermon outlines with 4 matching small group studies. There's 6 years worth for you already sitting there. We're now graphically designing them, and you can buy that yellow thing out there for $30. And we've created the PowerPoints and the Facebook flyers and everything else that you could use to help this equipping take place through pulpit and small group. Finally, the strategic place of the combined is that it's the majority reach. To give you the statistical breakdown very quickly, an Australian study in 2002 revealed that 6 out of 10 non-church Australians had no church-going friends. It means that 4 out of 10 did. If we are to assume somehow that 1 out of 4 Christians whose friends know they're Christian are proactively trying to share the gospel, share Christ and share faith messages, some might say that's a bit generous, but let's assume, that means that 1 out of 10 non-Christians have someone trying to connect Christian messages with them. Now, if we're very generous toward all of our community ministries and we somehow suggest that all of our different community efforts out of our churches are connecting Christian messages with 10% of the non-church population, noting that most don't really hardly even include the gospel these days, but let's imagine that is all of our efforts at the individual small group and church level, connecting Christian messages potentially with 20% of the non-church population. So if you are to say that that's all that's needed, I'm feeling a bit upset because you've just told me that 80% of the non-church population can be damned as far as you are concerned. The combined piston is phenomenally important, and it is almost entirely dysfunctional because of the way that we are thinking as churches. Having reflected on this here in New Zealand over the last 8 years, I've written a book, because what else are you supposed to do when you think about something? It'll come out next year. That's a make-up title cover, but it's called The Rule of the Regency Council. And the opening illustration in the introduction is this. Imagine there's 40 types of motor vehicles in New Zealand, Suzuki, Toyota, whatever. And one wealthy person decides to purchase all 40 companies or franchises in New Zealand. That person would have phenomenal economic inefficiencies within their 40 companies because they would have separate head offices, separate distribution networks, separate car yards, and separate marketing budgets, and the marketing budgets would be competing against each other, which doesn't make sense because for every dollar spent, he earns no more money. But let's just imagine that the diversity of cars we have make this inefficiency worth it. That's the church. Imagine 40 different denominations, all owned by one owner, God, and we're somehow all got our different separate stuff. But let's just imagine that the diversity of denominations and the people that can reach somehow makes those myriads of inefficiencies worth it. Now, something fundamental changes in culture. Suddenly, instead of having an 80% market share in the motor vehicle industry, it moves across to the side and people begin to use electric bicycles, which are pretty cool. They begin to use scooters, public trains and public buses. And the motor vehicle share goes from 80 to 70 to 60 to 50, and it's now on 40%. What would the owner of the 40 companies do? Would he continue to sit there and watch these inefficiencies and the motor vehicle industry dying in the nation and all his money going out the window? No, he wouldn't. He could potentially combine the plant of some of them and the offices and the distribution networks and combine some sales yards. It would make sense. But let's imagine even if he didn't do that, he would most certainly come to all of those businesses and say, I am taking your marketing budget. Because we don't need to have 20 or 40 competing marketing strategies in this country when we're losing our market share. We need one marketing strategy and it will say this: motor vehicles are awesome. We will promote the use of motor vehicles. This is what I believe has happened in New Zealand. In the early 2000s, we crossed a cultural tipping point. Christianity is on the way out. Changes in politics and in morality are changing faster than ever. The truths of our nation are not determined by what is true. They're determined by public consensus. A politician doesn't get to set the laws and the morality except when they override conscience votes. In the way it's supposed to be, they stand upon the heads of the people. And so if the people decide that, spitting on the doors of something is a respect, then the government could pass a law that you must spit on the doors of something. But if they try to make a law when the people don't agree, that will be political suicide. So I don't think the politicians alone can change the country. I think that the people have a responsibility to change the thinking of the people, because that's the platform upon which the politicians stand. How did I get to that out of this illustration? I have no clue what that mind jump was. One marketing budget. Our denominational structures can serve some great purposes like the accountability and support of churches here, there and everywhere, but you know what our denominational structures can't do? There's nothing we need to change in them, from my opinion, but we've got to open up our thinking in a different area. What they can never lead in is mission. A denomination cannot lead in mission. I would say that denominations, just so we don't get confused, I would say denominations aren't the church. They are support structures to the church, and they play valuable roles in training, support and accountability. But the church is responsible for its mission. I think the denomination should say, you need to be engaged in mission. I'm going to train you as to how to equip and mobilise your members, and I encourage you that you need to connect with the other pastors in your city and town, because you've got a responsibility in the city and town. But mission itself takes place here when I'm back in Tauranga or in the Tauranga Moana. And if I'm in a AOG church or a whatever, and I come in, it's not the prerogative of the AOG churches of the area to reach the whole province, as if we were the church. No, it's the prerogative of all the churches combined in the city to reach the city. It's not a denominational thing, it's a geographic thing. The capital C church is geographically identified. So what is the key change in thinking that's needed? I think there's a number of them, but I think the best and most provocative phrase, similar to a couple of others I gave earlier, like your key to being mobilised evangelistically is to remove the agenda of sharing the gospel. It's deliberately provocative to help us get something, and it is this. For years we've been saying that the local church is the hope of the world. I no longer believe, and I'm sincere here, I no longer believe the local church is the hope of the world. Instead, I believe the church is the hope of the world. And there is a very big difference between these two things. If the local church is the hope of the world, we are saying that 80% of the non-church population can be damned. We need the united function. A local church is a subset of the church in the city. Just as a church small group is accountable to the church that it is in, a local church is accountable to the church in the city that it is in. A small group cannot decide to have a competing event at Christmas when the church has its big function. Maybe a local church is subservient to a few city functions that are unique. The agenda of the city is probably determined by what the local churches can't achieve or do, and so it's therefore filling the gaps. It's a gap-filling function. It's necessarily spirit-led. And I would also say, just to throw some real cans of worms out, that the church in the city is accountable to the church in the nation. And the church in the nation is spirit-led. There's no group of people that represent it. God raises up different people at different times for different things, and the onus is upon us to discern who is God raising up in the city for what purpose, who is God raising up in the nation, and in good Christian faith and love, we are mutually accountable to each other. It's a voluntary accountability. It's not a hierarchy system above and below. We're beside. And God calls some people to a national function or to a city function or to a local church function. And so if we stop the accountability line here and say, no, it comes to the local church and then to the denomination, I believe we've interrupted God's authority and leadership structure. The denomination is the support structure to the church, but that local church is still a part of the church in the city. And we have to process this. We have to let this thought do its work, because the voice of the church in the public square at the city and national levels, which is what I'm going to speak about to finish the conference, is choking. And we have crossed a cultural tipping point, and we are losing the war. If we don't sort this one out, we are in trouble. The fact is, if you looked at things statistically, we're already in trouble. So the four pistons, the individual, its strategic place is that it is the most important piston, the key change in thinking, conversation, not confrontation. The church small group is the home base of outreach. The key change in thinking, church small groups do have a mission. It is a part of their function. The local church, its strategic place is that it's the starting point. It begins with leadership. The key change in thinking is habit-based mobilisation, not program-based. And then piston 4, the combined effort at the city and national level. Its strategic place is the majority reach. And the key change in thinking is this: the local church is not the hope of the world. The church is. The church has a mission. A change in thinking can lead to a change in behaviour. And a change in behaviour, I guarantee you, can lead to a change in possibilities. Father, I ask that these seed thoughts would do their work and that they would germinate in our hearts and minds in the weeks, months, and maybe years to come. I pray that we would see a change where in our nation we would continue to have healthy denominations, that we would have healthy churches, we would have healthy parachurches, but that we would also have a healthy church, capital C, in the city and in the nation. That we would somehow develop the perspective set needed to enable all four pistons in outreach mobilisation to be functioning healthily. That we would have a voice in this nation that can be heard, that we would have influence, and that all of this could be used to make this nation a better place. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.